Ferrari arrives in China thinking that they are still one step behind, that Mercedes is still the reference, and that the car's true potential will still take a few races to appear. Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. But suddenly, Lewis Hamilton begins to set times that not even within the team itself expected. Not only in classification, not just in the sprint, but also in race pace. And when the weekend ends, Charles Leclerc and Frédéric Vasseur sit down to analyze the telemetry. What they find in the data of car number 44 leaves them completely surprised. Because Hamilton wasn't gaining time on the straights. I wasn't using any weird car tricks. I was doing it corner after corner, braking after braking, in the most technical areas of a Shanghai circuit. And that's when within Ferrari they begin to realize something much bigger. Maybe Lewis Hamilton already understood the Ferrari much sooner than anyone expected. But the real question is, what exactly did Leclerc and Vasseur see in Hamilton's car data that left them completely on the wrong foot in China? In Shanghai, a story began to form that within Ferrari was not in the team's initial plans. After a difficult first Grand Prix in Australia, where the car's real performance had been somewhat obscured by strategic errors and difficult conditions, Ferrari arrived in China with the feeling that they were still trying to fully understand the potential of their new car. Nobody within the team expected that the second weekend of the year would be the stage where one of its drivers would begin to completely change the narrative of the project. Lewis Hamilton arrived in China still in the process of adapting to the team. A short time had passed since his arrival at Ferrari, and as he himself had acknowledged, the process of learning the car, the systems and communication with the engineers was still under construction. However, from the first moments of the weekend, something began to appear that caught our attention inside the garage. The Briton felt much more comfortable with the car than many imagined for this early stage of the season. This change began to be noticed especially in the pace he showed in the competitive sessions over the weekend. In qualifying, Hamilton managed to place himself very close to the level that the Mercedes were showing, something that was already an important sign for Ferrari because the distance with the German team was less than what they had anticipated before arriving at the Shanghai circuit. In fact, the margin was reduced to just about 0.3, a difference that in Formula One can completely change the perception of a car's real performance. But what really started to spark attention within the team occurred during the sprint. There, Hamilton was not only competitive, but he even fought directly with George Russell, one of the drivers who represented Mercedes' direct reference at that time. That duel made something very important clear. The Ferrari had enough pace to fight at the top if everything worked correctly during the weekend. From that moment on, the atmosphere within the team began to change. Ferrari no longer saw the Chinese Grand Prix as simply another race on the calendar, but as an opportunity to confirm whether the car was really closer to the performance of the top teams than they had initially thought. And while all this was happening on the track, both Charles Leclerc and Frédéric Vasseur began to look more closely at the data coming from Hamilton's car. The race ended confirming those sensations. Hamilton managed to turn that performance into his first podium with Ferrari, a performance that he himself described as one of the most enjoyable races he had had in a long time. The car allowed it to fight wheel to wheel, defend positions, and attack at different times of the test, something that indicated that the balance of the car was working much better than the team had expected before the weekend. The first thing they observed was that Hamilton was not gaining time in the typical places where differences are normally explained in Formula One. It was not a question of top speed on the straights, nor of a more aggressive engine mode, nor of a specific sector of the circuit where the Ferrari had a clear advantage. Time appeared distributed in a much more subtle way, and at the same time much more difficult to replicate, small tenths that accumulated throughout the entire lap. When the engineers directly compared the lines and data between Hamilton and Leclerc, they began to notice a very clear pattern. In several corners of the Shanghai circuit, Leclerc even arrived with a very competitive entry speed, sometimes even slightly higher. But the point where Hamilton began to make a difference was just after that initial moment of braking. The Briton had a very particular way of managing the transition between braking and the apex of the curve. He started strong in the initial phase, stabilized the car before reaching the turning point, and managed to position it extremely cleanly for the start. This seemingly small transition generated a huge advantage because it allowed him to apply the accelerator earlier and with greater stability, something that was repeated corner after corner throughout the entire lap. From a technical point of view, this had a direct impact on two fundamental areas of the car's performance. The first was traction when exiting corners, a key aspect on a circuit like Shanghai that combines several medium-speed corners with long subsequent accelerations. The second was the management of the rear tire, since by not forcing the car at the start, Hamilton could maintain the pace for longer without excessively degrading the tires. When Frédéric Vasseur reviewed this data with the technical team, the conclusion was quite clear. The difference that Hamilton was generating was not due to an external factor or an advantage of the car itself, but rather to a very specific way of driving the Ferrari that was extracting performance in extremely technical areas of the circuit. This explained why the Briton was able to maintain such a consistent pace throughout the race stints and why his performance had been so solid throughout the weekend. For Leclerc, this comparison was also particularly interesting. It was not a big difference in a single spectacular corner, but rather a sum of small details that ended up creating a more efficient lap. In Formula One, these small differences are precisely what separate drivers who are simply fast from those who manage to completely master the behavior of the car. And it was at that moment that an idea began to emerge within Ferrari that no one had seriously considered before arriving in China. Maybe Lewis Hamilton wasn't just adapting to the Ferrari. The analysis that Ferrari carried out after the Chinese Grand Prix left a conclusion that began to change the team's internal perception of the season. What initially seemed like just an isolated good result began to be seen as a much more important signal about the project's real potential. Because if something was clear after reviewing all the data from the weekend, it is that Lewis Hamilton's performance had not been a coincidence or a specific circumstance at the Shanghai circuit. Frédéric Vasseur quickly understood what this meant for Ferrari. During pre-season, and after the first Grand Prix, the team had assumed that they were still a few steps behind Mercedes in terms of overall performance. However, the pace that Hamilton had shown in qualifying, in the sprint, and especially during the long race, suggested something completely different. Ferrari was much closer to its direct rivals than they had thought before arriving in China. For Charles Leclerc, this situation also represented an interesting moment within the team. For years, he had been Ferrari's internal reference, the driver around whom many of the car's configurations and developments were built. But now he had in front of him a 7-time world champion who was beginning to decipher the Ferrari's behavior at surprising speed. And the most striking thing is that Hamilton was doing it through small technical details that, once understood, could become a huge advantage during the rest of the season. This began to generate a new dynamic within the team. Instead of seeing Hamilton's performance simply as an individual result, Ferrari began to interpret it as an extremely valuable source of information for the development of the car. Each of those differences in the way of attacking corners, each of those cleaner transitions between braking and acceleration, now became data that could help improve the general behavior of the car. And that is where the most interesting part of this whole story appears. Because if Hamilton had been able to find that level of performance so early in his time with Ferrari, that meant that the adaptation process between driver and car was progressing much faster than the team itself had anticipated. And in modern Formula One, when a driver begins to feel completely connected to the car, the next step is often even more dangerous for rivals. Ferrari left Shanghai with something more important than a good result. He came away with the feeling that perhaps they were beginning to discover the true potential of their project. And if what Leclerc and Vasseur saw in Hamilton's data is confirmed in the next races on the calendar, then the Chinese Grand Prix could be remembered as the moment when something began to change within Ferrari. After everything that happened at the Chinese Grand Prix, Ferrari left Shanghai with a very different feeling than before arriving at the circuit. What started as a weekend in which the teams simply hoped to continue understanding their new car ended up becoming very clear proof that the project's potential could be much greater than they initially thought. And much of that perception changed thanks to the performance that Lewis Hamilton was able to show throughout the weekend. When Charles Leclerc and Frédéric Vasseur reviewed the car's data after the race, they understood that they were not dealing with an isolated result or a specific circumstance on the circuit. Hamilton had found performance in extremely technical areas of the track, building his advantage through small details in braking, in the transition to the apex, and in the way he applied power when exiting corners. This sum of small margins is precisely what marks the real differences between the best drivers in Formula One. For Ferrari, this represents something very important for the rest of the season. If Hamilton has been able to achieve that level of connection with the car so early in his time with the team, then the room for growth that still exists could be enormous. Each race will allow us to better understand the behavior of the car, improve the configurations, and further exploit the potential that has already begun to be shown in Shanghai. At the same time, for Charles Leclerc, this situation also opens a new chapter within the team. Having a driver like Hamilton on the other side of the garage means constantly competing against one of the historical references of this sport, but it also means having a technical and competitive reference that can help push the team forward. That's why the Chinese Grand Prix could end up being much more than just a race on the calendar. It could be the moment when within Ferrari they began to realize that the project had something special. Because when a driver like Lewis Hamilton starts to feel really comfortable with a car, usually what comes next is when the story starts to get really interesting. Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now you really think about all this.